I'm back this week with Chapter 5 in Electronic Commerce by Gary P. Schneider. This week we're going to talk about business-to-business activities, improving efficiency, and reducing costs. Since the first companies evolved during the Industrial Revolution, they've sought ways to cut costs and operate more efficiently by streamlining their internal manufacturing processes. As more countries around the world developed increasingly reliable transportation and governmental infrastructures, companies felt more comfortable contracting with foreign providers for various business functions, despite technological and cultural differences between countries. One potential source of business service workers existed and still exists in the poorest countries of the world. The lack of infrastructure, water, electricity, and roads in less developed countries often limited the kinds of business activities in these countries. The internet, however, has changed this. Samasource is a not-for-profit organization that facilitates connections between these potential workers and work that high-tech companies need to have done. Samasource contracts with large companies that have specific business needs, such as data entry, transcriptions, creating captions for images, error checking information in databases, translating text, and so on. Samasource then breaks down these projects into small tasks that workers can perform anywhere in the world, as long as they have an internet connection. Samasource has lifted more than 3,800 African, Asian, and Haitian workers and their families above the poverty line by lining them up for work with companies such as Google, Microsoft, Walmart, and Getty Images, and providing necessary technology and connectivity resources. Organizations such as Samasource help businesses in the developed world get tasks accomplished more cost-effectively. At the same time, they help build worker knowledge and skills in less developed countries that can help industries grow there. Global industries see this development of trained workforces that can eventually support manufacturing industries as a good long-term strategy. The internet helps bring together work and workers in a way that does a great deal of good for people in need all around the world. In this chapter, we're going to learn how businesses use the internet to improve purchasing, logistics, and other support activities, how the internet facilitates implementation of outsourcing and offshoring business strategies, how electronic data exchange works and how it has evolved using internet technologies, what supply chain management is and how businesses are using internet technologies to improve it, how various types of online marketplaces operate to make B2B transactions easier and more efficient. In this chapter, you're going to learn how companies use electronic commerce to improve their business processes, including purchasing and logistics, primary activities, and all of the processes relating to their support activities, which include finance and administration, human resources, and technology development. I encourage you to look back at Figure 1.9 in Chapter 1 and review the value chain for a strategic business unit. Although the work may not seem as creative as designing a website or developing an advertising campaign, the potential earnings impact of cost reductions and business process improvements in purchasing, logistics, and support activities is tremendous. As I mentioned in the beginning, here's a little background information on Samasource. Leela Jana started it in 2008, and it links workers in developing countries with companies who need work done. At this time, this company, Samasource, has lifted more than 6,500 African, Asian, and Haitian workers above the poverty line. It's very cost-effective for businesses, builds worker knowledge and skills in less developed countries, and gives low-income workers in developed countries similar opportunities. An important characteristic of purchasing, logistics, and support activities is flexibility. A purchasing or logistics strategy that works this year may not work next year. Fortunately, economic organizations are evolving from the hierarchical structures used since the Industrial Revolution to new and more flexible network structures. The use of other organizations to perform certain activities in a business is called outsourcing. When outsourcing is done by organizations in other countries, it's often called offshoring. Outsourcing and offshoring have existed for decades, but the activities outsourced were typically manufacturing activities. The internet has enabled companies to outsource with many of their non-manufacturing activities as well as the manufacturing. Some of the business process offshoring might include purchasing, research and development, record keeping, and information management. You also see impact sourcing, or also called smart sourcing, done by or through not-for-profit organizations. Purchasing activities may include identifying and evaluating vendors, selecting specific products, placing orders, and resolving any issues that might arise after receiving the ordered goods or services. Issues might include late deliveries, incorrect quantities, incorrect items, and or defective items. Remember that in Chapter 1, you learned how companies can organize their strategic business unit activities using an industry value chain. The part of an industrial value chain that precedes a particular strategic business unit is called that business unit's supply chain. A company's supply chain for a particular product or service includes all of the activities undertaken by every predecessor in the value chain to design, produce, promote, market, deliver, and support each individual component of that product or service. For example, the supply chain of an automobile manufacturer includes every activity undertaken by each individual component supplier, including engine manufacturers, steel fabricators, glass manufacturers, wiring harness assemblers, and thousands of others. The purchasing department within most companies traditionally has been charged with buying all of the components at the lowest possible price. Usually, staff in the purchasing department would do this by identifying a qualified vendor and then asking them to prepare bids that described what they would supply and how much they would charge. The purchasing staff would then select the lowest bid that still met the quality standards for the component. This bidding process led to a very competitive environment with a large number of suppliers, and this process focused excessively on the cost of individual components and ignored the total supply chain costs, including the cost to the manufacturing organization of dealing with such large numbers of suppliers. As you learned in Chapter 1, many managers call this function procurement instead of purchasing to distinguish the broader range of responsibilities. Procurement generally includes all purchasing activities, plus the monitoring of all elements of purchase transactions. It also includes managing and developing relationships with key suppliers. Another term that's used to describe procurement activities is supply management or supply chain management. In many companies, the procurement staff must have high levels of product knowledge to identify and evaluate appropriate suppliers. The part of procurement activity devoted to identifying suppliers and determining the qualifications of these suppliers is called sourcing. The use of internet technologies in sourcing activities is called e-sourcing. As you can see, business purchasing process includes many steps. The business purchasing process also requires a number of people to coordinate their individual activities as part of the process. In a large company, the procurement department that supervises the purchasing process might include hundreds of employees who supervise the purchasing of materials, inventory for resale, supplies, and all of the other items that the company needs to buy. Figure 5.1 shows you the steps in a typical business purchasing process. You can follow this around on your own. Remember that the total dollar amount of the goods and services that a company buys during a year is collectively known as its spend. Let me go back one. The Institute for Supply Management is the main organization for procurement professionals. ISM runs conferences, publishes a monthly journal, and offers helpful information on its website. Let's talk about direct versus indirect materials purchasing. Businesses make a distinction between direct and indirect materials. Direct materials are those that become a part of the finished product in a manufacturing process. Steel manufacturers, for example, consider the iron ore that they purchase to be a direct material. The procurement process for direct materials is an important part of any manufacturing business because the cost of direct materials is usually a very large part of the cost of the finished product. In large manufacturing companies like auto manufacturers, there are two types of direct materials purchasing. The first type is called replenishment purchasing or contract purchasing. The company negotiates long-term contracts for most of the materials that we'll need. For example, an auto manufacturer might estimate how many cars it's going to make during a year and contract with 2 or 3 steel mills to supply most of the steel that it will need to build those cars. By negotiating contracts in advance and guaranteeing the purchase, the auto manufacturer obtains low prices and good delivery terms. Of course, actual demand never matches expected demand perfectly. If demand is higher than the auto company's estimate, it must buy additional steel during the year. These purchases are made in loosely organized market that includes steel mills, warehouses, speculators who buy and sell contracts for future delivery of steel, and companies that have excess steel that they purchased on contract. So the demand for their products was lower than they had anticipated. This market is called a spot market. And buying in this market, the second type of direct materials purchasing, is called spot purchasing. Indirect materials are all other materials that the company purchases, including factory supplies such as sandpaper, hand tools, and replacement parts for manufacturing machinery. Things like maintenance, repair, and operating supplies are indirect materials that are purchased on a recurring basis. A number of customers buy these indirect material products on a recurring basis, and many of them are commodities. That is, they're standard items that buyers usually select using price as their main criteria. Most companies have a difficult time controlling these MRO or maintenance, repair, and operating supplies. And one way that procurement departments have controlled MRO spending is by issuing purchasing cards, sometimes known as P cards. They resemble credit cards, and they give individual managers the ability to make multiple small purchases at their discretion while providing cost tracking information to the procurement office. Some of the leading suppliers for MRO supplies are McMaster Carr and W.W. Grainger. Office equipment and supplies are the big boys are Office Depot, Staples, DigiKey, and Newark Element 14 sell electronic parts. The classic objective of logistics is to provide the right goods in the right quantities in the right place at the right time. Logistics management is an important support activity for both the sales and the purchasing activities in a company. Logistics activities also include managing the inbound movement of materials and supplies and the outbound, as well as the outbound movement of finished goods and services. Receiving, warehousing, controlling inventory, scheduling and controlling vehicles, and distributing finished goods are all logistics activities. The Internet is providing a number of opportunities to manage these activities better, as it provides lower transaction costs and constant connectivity between firms engaged in logistics management. Web-enabled automated warehouse operations are saving companies millions of dollars every year. When transportation and freight companies engage in the business of operating all or a large portion of a customer's materials movement activities, the company is called a third-party logistics or 3PL provider. For example, Ryder has a multi-year contract to design, manage, and operate all of Whirlpool's inbound freight activities and is considered a 3PL provider to Whirlpool. Both FedEx and UPS have freight tracking web pages available to their customers. Firms that run their own trucking operations have implemented tracking systems that use global positioning satellites or GPS technology to monitor vehicle movements. With sensors in the vehicles that track speed, throttle positions, adjustable air suspension settings, and fuel consumption, it's now possible to manage each vehicle in real time when those sensors are connected through mobile internet access to a central operations location. Many of these freight handling companies also provide 3PL services to other businesses as a way to generate additional income from their investments in tracking technologies. Truckers themselves have benefited from advances in internet technologies, in particular the increase in mobile device connectivity. A variety of smartphone and tablet apps can warn a trucker of all kinds of risks like traffic jams, weather-related slowdowns, and highway construction. There are other apps that include information about permanent threats like low overpasses, tight turns, and roads that prohibit commercial vehicle traffic, and current threats like heavy traffic, construction, and speed traps as they develop. The marriage of GPS and portable computers with the internet is one example of second-wave electronic commerce. The addition of mobile devices into the mix is an example of third-wave electronic commerce. Activities that support all of a business's processes include finance and administration tasks, the operation of human resources, and technology development activities. Finance and administration business processes include activities like making payments, processing payments from customers, planning capital expenditures, and budgeting and planning to ensure that sufficient funds will be available to meet the organization's obligations as they come through. The operation of the computing infrastructure and database management functions of the organization is also an administration activity. Human resource processes include activities like hiring, training, and evaluating employees, administering benefits, and complying with government record-keeping regulations. Technology development includes networking research scientists into virtual collaborative work groups, sharing research results, publishing research papers online, and providing connections to outside sources of research and development services. You can find these categories of support activities summarized in Figure 5.2. Oops, sorry, I want to go back here. Maybe back here. I want to mention knowledge management. Knowledge management is the intentional collection, classification, and dissemination of information about a company, its product, and its processes. This type of knowledge is developed over time by individuals working for or with a company and is often difficult to gather and distill. You're going to learn a lot more about this in Chapter 9. Governments perform many important functions for the individual citizens, businesses, and other organizations that they serve. Many of these functions can be enhanced by online technologies. Governments also perform business-like activities. For example, they employ people, they buy supplies from vendors, and they distribute benefit payments of many kinds. Citizens can download blank tax forms, passport applications, and other documents. And they also collect a variety of taxes and fees and can use the internet to make that process more efficient, if not more pleasant. The use of internet technologies by governments and government agencies to perform these functions is often called e-government. The U.S. government's Financial Management Service, FMS, is responsible for collecting trillions of dollars of tax, license, and other fee revenue. It also pays out trillions of dollars in Social Security benefits, veterans benefits, tax refunds, and other disbursements. The FMS uses pay.gov website to handle much of this financial activity, and the U.S. government's Bureau of Public Debt operates the Treasury Direct site, which allows individuals to buy savings bonds and financial institutions to buy treasury bonds, bills, bonds, and notes. The U.S. state governments also have websites for conducting business and interacting with their citizenry. And we can take a look at the California e-government website, california.gov. You can look at that in your book, Figure 5.3. That's a portal for our state of California. This site gives visitors access to every California government agent and state operation. You can transact a wide variety of business with the state, from renewing your driver's license to reserving a campsite. This site gives Californians one site through which they can virtually conduct all of their business with the state. For businesses, the site offers the full text of all California business laws and regulations. It also provides information about how to sell to and buy from the state and its agencies. Most other states and other countries, in fact, have similar websites. States can reduce the cost of providing services while providing those services more efficiently if they use web technology. And some of the more common services that might be offered by a state or similar regional governments are things like access to the text of state laws and regulations, renewal of various licenses, promotion of the state to business considering new locations, promotion of the state, to businesses considering new locations, job listings, promotion of tourism, tax forms, and filing information, and information for companies that want to do business with the state. In Chapter 1, you learned about 3 different forms of economic organization: markets, hierarchies, and networks. A significant trend in purchasing, logistics, and support activities is the shift away from hierarchical structures towards network structures. The traditional purchasing model had one hierarchically structured firm negotiating purchase terms with similarly structured supplier firms, playing each supplier against the others. As typical in a network organization, more businesses are now giving their procurement departments new tools to negotiate with suppliers, including the possibility of forming strategic alliances. For example, a buying firm might enter into an alliance with a supplier to develop a new technology that will reduce overall product costs. The technology department might be done by a third firm using research conducted by a fourth firm. Some researchers who study the interaction of firms within an industry value chain are now using the term supply web instead of supply chain, because many industry value chains no longer consist of a single sequence of companies linked in a single line, but include many parallel lines that are interconnected in a web or network configuration made up of strategic alliances or complex configurations of outsourcing contracts. The roots of web technology for B2B transactions lie in a hierarchical structured approach to inter-firm information transfer, which is called electronic data exchange. In Chapter 1, you learn that electronic data exchange is a computer-to-computer transfer of business information between two businesses that uses a standard format of some kind. The two businesses that are exchanging information are trading partners. Firms that exchange data in specific standard formats are said to be EDI compatible. The business information exchange is often transaction data. However, it can also include other information related to the transactions, such as price quotes and order status inquiries. Transaction data in business-to-business B2B transactions include the information that was traditionally included on paper documents. The data from invoices, purchase orders, requests for quotations, bills of lading, and receiving reports accounts for more than 75% of all the information exchanged by U.S. trading departments. EDI was one of the first forms of electronic commerce to be widely used in business, beginning some 20 years before anyone ever even used the term electronic commerce, and it continues to be an important part of B2B, handling an estimated $4 trillion in transactions worldwide every year. Understanding EDI is important because most B2B electronic commerce is based on EDI or adapted from EDI. It's also important because EDI is still the single most commonly used technology in online B2B transactions. The dollar amount of EDI transactions today is about equal to that of all the other B2B transaction technologies combined. So in this section, we're going to take a look at the brief history of EDI and explain how it works. We'll also look at why EDI is better than processing mountains of paper transactions. In 1968, a number of freight and shipping companies joined together to attack their collective paperwork burden. They created a standardized information set that included all of the data and elements that shippers commonly included on bills of lading, freight invoices, shipping manifests, and other paper forms. Instead of printing a paper form, shippers could convert information about shipments into a computer file that they could then send to any freight company that had adopted the standard. The freight company could then transfer the standardized data into its own information systems. The costs saved by not printing or handling forms, not re-entering data, and avoiding errors were significant, even for smaller shippers and freight carriers. Even though these industry-specific data exchange standards were helpful, their benefits were limited to members of the standard-setting groups in those specific industries. Most businesses that are in one industry buy goods and services from businesses that are in other industries. So the full realization of economies and insufficiencies required standards that could be used by companies in all industries, which led to the birth of EDI. Oops, sorry. I was a little bit behind in my slides. So let's catch up. There we go. The emergence of broader standards. The American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, has been the coordinating body for standards of the United States since 1918. But it does not set standards. It maintains procedures for the development of national standards and accredits committees that follow those procedures. In 1979, ANSI chartered a new committee to develop uniform EDI standards, and this committee is called the Accredited Standards Committee X12. The ASC X12 committee and its subcommittees include information systems professionals from hundreds of businesses. The administrative body that coordinates ASC X12 activities is the Data Exchange Standards Association, or DISA, and the ASC X12 standard currently includes specifications for several hundred transaction sets, which are the names of the formats for specific business data exchanges. The X12 standards were quickly adopted by major firms in the U.S., but businesses in other countries continue to use their own national standards. In the mid-1980s, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe invited North America and European EDI experts to work together on designing a common set of EDI standards. In 1987, the United Nations published its first standards under the title EDI for Administration, Commerce, and Transport, also known as EDIFACT or UN EDIFACT. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to read all that out loud or spell out the letters, but you get my drift. I'm going to go forward a little bit and then go back to that figure. Although the basic idea behind EDI is straightforward, the implementation can be complicated, even in fairly simple business situations. So consider a company that needs a replacement for one of its metal cutting machines. We'll go through this section, the steps involved in making this purchase using a paper-based system, and then explain how the process would change using EDI. So in a paper-based purchasing process, the buyer and the vendor are not using any integrated software for business processes internally. So each information processing step results in the production of a paper document that has to be delivered to the department handling the next step. Information transfer between the buyer and the vendor is also paper-based and can be delivered by mail, courier, or fax. The information flows that occur in the paper-based version of the purchasing process example are shown in figure 5.5. I'll kind of switch over here. So once the production manager in the operating unit decides that the metal cutting machine needs to be replaced, the following process begins. The production manager completes a purchase requisition form and sends it to purchasing. The requisition describes the machine that is needed to perform the metal cutting operation. Next, purchasing contacts vendors to negotiate price and terms of delivery. When purchasing has selected a vendor, it prepares a purchase order and forwards it to the mailroom. Purchasing also sends one copy of the purchase order to the receiving department so that receiving can plan to accept delivery when scheduled. And purchasing sends another copy to accounting to advise it of the financial implications of the order. The mailroom sends the purchase order it receives from purchasing to the selected vendor over here by mail or courier. The vendor's mailroom receives the order and forwards it to the sales department. The vendor's sales department prepares a sales order that it sends to the accounting department and a work order that it sends to manufacturing. The work order describes the machine's specifications and authorizes manufacturing to begin work on it. When the machine is completed, manufacturing notifies accounting and sends the machine to shipping. The accounting department sends the original invoice to the mailroom and a copy of the invoice to the shipping department. Mailroom mails the invoice to the buyer. Back over here. The vendor's shipping department uses its copy of the invoice to create a bill of lading and sends it with the machine to the buyer. The buyer's mailroom receives the invoice about the same time as its receiving department receives the machine with its bill of lading. The buyer's mailroom sends one copy of the invoice to purchasing so that the purchasing department knows that the machine was received and sends the original invoice to accounting. The buyer's receiving department checks the machine against the bill of lading and its copy of the purchase order. If the machine is in good condition and matches the specifications on the bill of lading and the purchase order, receiving completes a receiving report, sends it to accounting, and then delivers the machine to the operating unit. Accounting makes sure that all details on the copy of the purchase order, receiving report, and the original invoices match. If they do, accounting issues a check and forwards it to the mailroom. The buyer's mailroom sends the check by mail back over to the vendor. The vendor's mailroom receives the check and sends it to accounting. Accounting compares the check to its copies of the invoice, bill of lading, and sales orders. If all details match, accounting deposits the check into the vendor's bank and records the payments received. Now let's take a look at an EDI purchasing process. The mail service has been replaced with the data communications of an EDI network, and the flow of paper within the buyer's and the vendor's organizations have been replaced with computers running EDI translation software. The operating unit manager sends an electronic message to its purchasing department once the manager decides that the metal cutting machine needs to be replaced. The message describes the machine that is needed to perform the metal cutting operation. Purchasing contacts vendors by telephone, email, or through their websites to negotiate prices and terms of delivery. After selecting a vendor, purchasing sends a message to the buyer's EDI translator computer, converts to a standard format purchase order transaction set, and goes through a EDI network to the vendor, where the message is routed through its EDI translator and sent to the sales department. At that point, the message is automatically entered into the vendor's manufacturing department production management system, where the machine's specifications are provided so that manufacturing can begin work on building it, and the vendor's accounting system in their accounting department. Purchasing also sends electronic messages to the buyer's receiving department so that it can plan to accept delivery, and to the buyer's accounting department with details like the agreed upon price. When the machine is completed, manufacturing notifies accounting and sends the machine to the vendor's shipping department. The vendor's shipping department sends an electronic message to the accounting department indicating that the machine is ready to ship. It also sends an electronic message to the EDI translator computer that indicates that the machine is ready to ship. The EDI translator computer converts the message into a standard 856 transaction set advanced ship notification and forwards it through the EDI network to the buyer. The vendor's accounting department sends a message to its EDI translator computer, which converts the message to the standard invoice transaction set and forwards it through the EDI network to the buyer's EDI translator computer. Happens before the buyer's receiving department receives the machine. The computer then converts the invoice data into a format that the buyer's information system can use, and the invoice data becomes immediately available to the buyer's accounting department. When the machine arrives, the buyer's receiving department checks it against the purchase order data on the computer system. If the machine is in good condition and matches the specifications, receiving sends a message to accounting confirming that the machine has been received, and then it delivers the machine to the operating unit. The buyer's accounting department system compares all the details of the purchase order data, the receiving data, and the decoded invoice transaction set from the vendor. If all the details match, the accounting system notifies the bank to reduce the buyer's account and increase the vendor's account by the amount of the invoice. And the EDI network may also provide services that perform this task. So the same information is being provided to each department in each company, but EDI reduces paper flow and streamlines the information exchanges. The paper-based system has 16 individual steps compared to the 8 steps required to complete the same transaction using EDI. The 3 key elements, which are shown in this figure 5.6, that alter the process so dramatically are the EDI network instead of the mail service and the 2 EDI translator computers. Trading partners can implement the EDI network and EDI translation processes in several ways. Each of these ways uses one of the 2 basic approaches, direct connection or indirect connection. The first approach, called direct connection EDI, requires each business in the network to operate its own on-site EDI translator computer, as shown in the next figure. These EDI translator computers are then connected to each other using leased telecommunication lines. Because dedicated leased lines are expensive, only a very few large companies still use direct connection EDI. So you can see there. Instead of connecting directly to each of its trading partners, a company might decide to use the services of a value-added network. As you read about in Chapter 1, a value-added network, or a VAN, is a company that provides communications equipment, software, and skills that are needed to receive, store, and forward electronic messages that contain EDI transaction sets. To use the services of a VAN, a company must install EDI translator software that is compatible with the VAN, and often the VAN supplies this software as part of the operating agreement. To send an EDI transaction set to a trading partner, the VAN customer connects to the VAN using a dedicated telecommunications line and then forwards the EDI formatted message to the VAN. The VAN logs the message and delivers it to the trading partner's mailbox on the VAN computer. The trading partner then dials into the VAN and retrieves its EDI formatted messages from that mailbox. This approach is called indirect connection EDI because trading partners must pass through the VAN instead of connecting their own computers directly to each other. And you can see that type of indirect connection in figure 5.8. Some of the companies that provide VAN include Covalent Works and Promethean Software Services. There are some advantages to using a VAN. So users only need to support the VAN's one communication protocol instead of many possible protocols. The VAN can provide translation between different transaction sets used by different trading partners. The VAN can perform automatic compliance checking to ensure that the transaction is set in the specified EDI format. And the VAN records message activity in an audit log. This audit log becomes an independent record of transactions and can be helpful in resolving disputes between trading partners. Because EDI transactions are business contracts and they often involve large amounts of money, the existence of an independent audit log can help establish non-repudiation. And non-repudiation is the ability to establish that a particular transaction actually occurred. It prevents either party from repudiating or denying the transaction's validity or existence. In the past, VANs had one serious disadvantage, which was cost. Most of them required an enrollment fee, a monthly maintenance fee, and a transaction fee that ranged from a few cents to $1 on each transaction. But today they're much lower because VANs use the internet instead of leased telecommunication lines to connect to their customers. Many companies that provide VAN services today use the internet as their main data communication technology. EDI on the internet is called Internet EDI or Web EDI. It's also sometimes called Open EDI because the internet is an open architecture network, as you learned in Chapter 2. The EDI-INT, Electronic Data Exchange Internet Integration, also abbreviated EDI-INT, uses a set of protocols that's the most common set for the exchange of EDI transaction sets over the internet. Most EDI-INT exchanges are encoded using the AS2 Applicability Statement 2 specification, which is based on the ATTP rules for web page transfers. Although some companies are using a more specific or more secure specification, the AS3 applicability. I'm having problems with this word. Applicability Statement 3. You know what I mean. Both AS2 and AS3 transmissions return secure electronic receipts to the senders for every transaction, which also helps establish non-repudiation. That should say non-repudiation right there. Some EDI transaction sets provide instructions to a trading partner's bank. These transaction sets are negotiable instruments. That is, they are the electronic equivalent of checks. All banks have the ability to perform electronic funds transfers, EFTs, which is the movement of money from one bank account to another. The bank accounts involved in EFTs may be customer accounts or the accounts that banks keep on their own behalf with each other. When EFTs involve two banks, they are executed using an automated clearinghouse, or ACH, system, which is a service that banks use to manage their accounts with each other. In the United States, banks can use the ACH operated by the U.S. Federal Reserve Banks or one of the private ACHs operated by a group of banks or a separate company. And you'll learn a little bit more about this in Chapter 11. You learned earlier in this chapter that the part of an industry value chain that precedes a particular strategic business unit is called a supply chain. When companies integrate supply management and logistics activities across multiple participants in a particular product supply chain, The job of managing that integration is called supply chain management. I linked to a very entertaining YouTube video in this week's module that talks about supply chain management. You may enjoy watching that for a little bit of additional insight. The ultimate goal of supply chain management is to achieve a higher quality or lower cost product at the end of that chain. Businesses are realizing that they can save money and increase product quality by taking a more active role in negotiations with suppliers. By engaging suppliers in cooperative, long-term relationships, companies have found that they can work together with these suppliers to identify new ways to provide their own customers with faster, cheaper, and better service. The use of technologies to improve the efficiency of a company's operations is sometimes called supply chain competition, and it can help companies implement management techniques such as just-in-time and lean production. Companies use just-in-time inventory management to reduce inventory stocks of component parts purchased by arranging for delivery of those parts to occur very close to the time at which they are used in the manufacturing process. This lowers the cost of storing, tracking, insuring, and managing inventory by reducing it as close to zero as possible. Lean production methods focus on eliminating waste and unnecessary processes throughout the manufacturing process. Both of these management techniques require readily available and continuously updated information about demand, production schedules, and inventory availability from suppliers. Information that can be provided very effectively by a technology-enabled supply chain management system. Supply chain management was originally developed as a way to reduce costs. It focused on really specific elements in the supply chain and tried to identify opportunities for process efficiency. Today, supply chain management is used to add value in the form of benefits to the ultimate consumer at the end of the supply chain, which would be you and me. Businesses that engage in supply chain management work to establish long-term relationships with a small number of very capable suppliers. These suppliers, called Tier 1 suppliers, in turn develop long-term relationships with a larger number of suppliers that provide components and raw materials to them. These Tier 2 suppliers manage relationships with the next level of suppliers, called Tier 3 suppliers, that provide them with components and raw materials. A key element to all of these relationships is trust between the parties. The long-term relationships created among participants in the supply chain are called supply alliances. A key element in the coordination of supply chain activities is the establishment of a consistent production strategy that is adapted by all the supply chain participants. Production strategy is the way a company achieves competitive advantage in its product creation activities. The two most common strategies are efficient processing, in which the company tries to make products as quickly or inexpensively as possible, or market response flexibility, in which the company tries to produce the specific products demanded by the market as it changes. In other words, some companies structure themselves to be efficient producers, whereas others structure themselves to be flexible producers. Clear communications and a quick response to those communications are key elements of a successful supply chain management. Technologies, and especially the technologies of the internet and the web, can be very effective communications enhancers. When a company uses technology to respond quickly to changes in market demand and supplier conditions, it is said to have an adaptive supply chain, which can lead to higher efficiency, lower costs, and greater profits. In the next figure, we'll list the advantages of using internet technologies in supply chain management. And as you'll see, the only major disadvantage in using internet technologies in supply chain management is the cost of those technologies. But for most companies, The advantages provide greater value than the cost of implementing and maintaining the technologies. Many companies are now using internet and web technologies to manage supply chains in ways that yield increases in efficiency and cooperation throughout the chain. These companies have found ways to increase process speed, reduce costs, coordinate design efforts, and increase manufacturing flexibility so that they can respond to changes in the quantity and nature of the ultimate consumer demand. Example in your book is Boeing, which is the largest producer of commercial aircraft in the world, faces a huge task in keeping its production on schedule. Each airplane requires more than 1 million individual parts and assemblies, and each airplane is custom configured to meet the purchasing airline's exact specifications. Those parts and assemblies must be completed and delivered on schedule, or the production process comes to a halt. Using EDI and internet links, Boeing works with suppliers so that they can provide exactly the right part or assembly at exactly the right time. Even before an airplane enters into production, Boeing makes the engineering specifications and the drawings available to its suppliers through secure internet connections. As work on the airplane progresses, Boeing keeps every member of the supply chain continually informed of completion milestones and necessary schedule changes. Instead of waiting 36 months for delivery, customers, as in the past, customers can now have their new airplanes in 10 months or less. Using internet technologies as Boeing and an increasing number of precision manufacturing firms do, that is, to integrate the design, development, construction, testing, and refinement of products, is called collaborative commerce. Tracking materials as they move from one company to another and as they move within the company has always been a challenge. Companies have been using optical scanners and barcodes for many years to help track the movements of materials. In many industries, the integration of barcoding and EDI has become prevalent. In our next figure, you'll see a typical barcoded shipping label that's used in the auto industry. I'll go ahead and click to that so you can take a look at that. These barcodes allow companies to scan materials as they're received and to track them as they move from materials warehouses into productions. They can use this barcoded information along with information from their EDI systems to manage their inventory flows and forecast materials needed across their supply chains. Large online retailers like Amazon and Target maintain fulfillment centers from which they ship products that customers have ordered online. Tracking systems called real-time location systems, or RTLS, in these fulfillment centers use barcodes to monitor inventory movements and ensure that goods are shipped as quickly as possible. In the second wave of electronic commerce, companies are integrating new types of tracking into their internet-based materials tracking systems. The most promising technology now being used is radio frequency identification devices, RFIDs, which are small chips that use radio transmissions to track inventory. RFID technology has existed for many years, but until recently it required each RFID to have its own power supply, which was usually a battery. RFIDs that have their own power supply are called active RFIDs. RFIDs can be read much more quickly and with a higher degree of accuracy than barcodes. Barcodes have to be visible to be scanned, but RFIDs can be placed anywhere on or in most items and are readable even when covered with packing materials, dirt, or plastic bands. A barcode scanner has to be placed within a few inches of the barcode, but most RFID readers have a range of about 6 feet. An important development in RFID technology is the passive RFID, which can be made cheaply and in very small sizes. A passive RFID does not need a power source. It receives a radio signal from a nearby transmitter and extracts a tiny amount of power from that signal. It uses that power that it extracts to send a signal back to the transmitter. That signal includes information about the inventory item to which the RFID has been affixed. Passive RFIDs are small enough to be installed on the face of credit cards or sewn into clothing items. And then in figure 511, you can see a typical passive RFID. Industry observers believe that RFID tagging in retail will become really widespread, and indeed has become widespread, when retailers like Walmart and other big retailers will have them in all locations. There's some key features of barcode, passive RFID, and active RFID technologies. One of the main goals of supply chain management is to help each company in the chain focus on meeting the demands of the consumer at the end of the supply chain. Companies in industries with long supply chains have in the past often found it difficult to maintain this customer focus, which is sometimes called an ultimate consumer orientation. Instead, companies have directed their efforts towards meeting the needs of the next member in the supply chain. This is a short-sighted approach, and it can cause companies to miss opportunities to add value in subsequent steps of the chain. One company that pioneered the use of internet technology to go beyond the next step in its value chain is Michelin North America. Michelin has a highly respected brand name and reputation in the tire business. However, most consumers rely on local tire dealers to make specific recommendations when they need replacement tires for their vehicles. Michelin spends a great deal of money on direct advertising to its ultimate consumers. This advertising is directed at maintaining Michelin's well-known brand and convincing the consumer of the value of Michelin tires. The advertising and brand building effort can be wasted, however, if the consumer goes to a local tire dealer who's going to recommend another brand. So Michelin launched an online business initiative in 1995 called BIBnet, which is after the famous Michelin Man mascot, whose name is Bibendum. The goal of this initiative was to sell more Michelin tires to consumers, but the initiative was actually directed at Michelin tire dealers, not the ultimate consumers. BIBnet was an extranet that allowed tire dealers to access tire specifications, inventory status, and promotional information about Michelin products through a simple-to-use web browser interface. Before BIBnet, dealers calling Michelin for product information were sometimes placed on hold. A dealer who's talking to a customer cannot afford to wait on hold. So by giving dealers the power to access Michelin product information directly and immediately, Michelin saved money and gave dealers better service. Michelin has found that tire retailers that use BIBnet are much less likely to recommend a competitor's tires. The major issue that most companies must deal with in forming supply chain alliances is developing trust. Continual communication and information sharing are key elements in sharing trust. Because the internet and the web provide excellent ways to communicate and share information, they offer new avenues for building trust. Most procurement professionals have built trust on years of doing business with the same vendors. In some industries, vendors send sales representatives to call on buyers regularly. Vendors also participate actively in trade shows and conferences. By giving buyers frequent opportunities to interact with vendor representatives, vendors help build trust. And vendors are finding that the web gives them an opportunity to stay in contact with their customers more easily and less expensively. Although most buyers still see vendors' sales representatives regularly, email and the web have given them nearly instant access to their sales rep and other vendor personnel. Many supply chain management researchers are working on new ways to accumulate information about supplier performance and report that information to supply chain partners. This type of monitoring and reporting is being incorporated into the online marketplace and business networks that are described in the next section. In the late 1990s, a number of industry-focused hubs opened and began offering marketplaces and auctions in which companies in the industry could contact each other and transact business. The idea was that these hubs would offer a doorway or a portal to the internet for industry members. Because these hubs were vertically integrated, that was, Each hub would offer services to just one industry. They were called vertical portals. In this next section, we're going to talk about how these B2B marketplaces were conceived, developed, and operated as this sector of electronic commerce matured from 1997 through the present. The first vertical portals were trading exchanges that were focused on a particular industry. These vertical portals became known by various names that highlighted different elements of their collective nature, including industry marketplaces that were focused on a single industry, independent exchanges that were not controlled by a company that was an established buyer or seller in the industry, or public marketplaces, which were open to new buyers and sellers just entering the industry. These portals also became collectively known as independent industry marketplaces. Ventro opened its first industry marketplace, Chemdex, in early 1997 to trade in bulk chemicals. To leverage the high investment that it had made in trading exchange technology, Ventro followed Chemdex with web marketplaces in a range of industries, including specialty medical supply, food service, and general business products. Many other companies followed Ventro's lead, and by the mid-2000s, there were more than 2,200 independent exchanges in a wide variety of industries, but most of them were not earning profits, and today, fewer than 100 industry marketplaces are in operation. By 2010, various forms of B2B marketplaces had gradually replaced these independent marketplaces. In 2012, Amazon.com launched Amazon Supply, which is a marketplace for industrial goods that's now a part of its Amazon Business Marketplace service offerings. And Google followed a little bit later with Google Shopping for Suppliers, a similar service that was later folded into its Google Shopping site. You're going to learn about 4 B2B marketplace models: private stores, customer portals, private company marketplaces, and industry consortia sponsored marketplaces in the remainder of this section. The first one we'll look at is private store. As established companies in various industries watched new businesses open marketplaces, they became concerned that these independent operators would take control of transactions from them in supply chains, control that the established companies had spent years developing. Many of the large sellers had already invested heavily in websites that they believed would meet the needs of their customers better than any industry marketplace. For example, Cisco and Dell offer private stores for each of their major customers within their selling websites. A private store has a password-protected entrance and offers negotiated price reductions on a limited selection of products, usually those that the customer has agreed to purchase in certain minimum quantities. Other companies, like Grainger, provide additional services for their customers on the selling websites. These customer portal sites offer private stores along with services like part number cross-referencing, product usage guidelines, safety information, and other services that would be needlessly duplicated if the sellers were to participate in an industry marketplace. Similarly, large companies that purchase from relatively small vendors can exert comparable power over those vendors in purchasing negotiations. The procurement departments of these companies can install procurement software, which you're going to learn more about in Chapter 9, generally referred to as e-procurement software, that allows a company to manage its purchasing function through a web interface. It automates many of the authorizations and other steps that are part of a business procurement operation. A private company marketplace is a marketplace that provides auctions, requests for quote postings, and other features, many of which are similar to those of e-procurement software, to companies who want to operate their own marketplaces. Today, many private company marketplaces have expanded to include functions to allow supply chain participants to manage multiple functions, including manufacturing, Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers, distribution centers, transportation, orders, invoicing, and payments. These expanded arrangements are called private industrial networks or private trading exchanges. Again, I apologize for being one slide behind. Some companies had a relatively strong negotiating position in their industry supply chains, but they didn't have enough power to force suppliers to deal with them through a private company marketplace. and these companies began to form a consortia to sponsor marketplaces. An industry consortia-sponsored marketplace is a marketplace formed by several large buyers in a particular industry. Characteristics of the 5 general marketplace forms in B2B electronic commerce today are shown in the following figure. This figure summarizes the characteristics of the 5 general forms of marketplaces, and the information in this comes from Warren Reich, a web marketplace consultant. Although the figure shows 5 distinct B2B marketplace categories, the lines between them are not always clear. For example, Dell has from time to time sold other companies' products on its private store site, which would make it more like a customer portal than a private store. As the B2B marketplace industry matures, it's unlikely that one type of marketplace will become dominant, and most B2B experts believe that a variety of marketplaces with the characteristics of these 5 general categories will continue to exist for some time. And that concludes Chapter 5. Thank you for listening and watching. If you have any questions, be sure to message me or enter it into the Q&A forum, and I will talk to you soon.